are used a lot more in the vegetable or fruit crops than in our traditional agronomic crops. And so today is a little bit of an offshoot of a lecture. And I like to give this lecture because I was here at Cornell for 17 years, public sector maize breeder. I then left to join Cargill's hybrid seed company and manage their worldwide seed research and development, where basically we developed hybrid varieties with research in 26 countries worldwide and with seed sales in about 88, 89 countries worldwide. Then a few years ago, Cargill sold their seed business, and I opted to come back to Cornell. And so while I was here at Cornell, I was sure I knew what maize breeding was all about. I mean, I was here for 17 years and I was a maize breeder. My first year at Cargill, I learned that, wait a minute, I don't really know much about what plant breeding in the commercial sphere is about. And so there are quite a bit of differences. So I'll talk about some of those differences, but I'll also talk about some changing concepts and changing basis of support. And having lived through some of these changes, it's pretty easy for me to see which was the cause and which was an effect. More and more often today, I hear people that sort of look back over the state of arts today and sort of infer how we got there, and often they're a little bit off or they're totally off on sort of what led us to basically a privatization of plant breeding resources. So let's start with, I guess someone took my little stick, but they left me a ruler. Let's start with what plant breeding in the United States looked like when I started plant breeding here at Cornell in the early 70s. Farmers had the right to save their seed for all the varieties that they grew. The crops were either true breeding for most of the small grains and soybeans, or they were open pollinated varieties for crops like maize. Breeding was mostly publicly financed. There were, well, in the 70s there were, but if you go back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, there weren't any privately supported plant breeding programs. Most varieties were developed by land-grant colleges, the state university systems, or by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the majority of germplasm and variety development prior to the 60s was done by public institutions for both hybrids and varietal crops. These publicly supported programs were very essential. They built up, really, the agricultural revolution in the United States. They provided free access to germplasm to all other breeders. They required and still require long-term support. They produced varieties that are commodity products so that you couldn't really differentiate the performance of your variety versus everyone else's because everyone had the same varieties out of, or a lot of different people grew the same varieties from various public programs. They had difficulty, even in the 70s, competing with more attractive, exotic, but more importantly, short-term research opportunities. So we went through areas where mutation breeding was going to replace plant breeding because you could run a series of experiments and you could develop a grant proposal for 5 years, and at the end of 5 years you could complete the project. Whereas plant breeding, at the end of 5 years, you needed another 5 years to keep recombining and selecting and develop varieties. We went through a whole computerization change where a lot of support was given to developing models for measuring statistical differences and environmental by genotype interactions better. We went through all of the tissue culture applications and the fact that somoclonal variation and wide crosses were getting a lot of the research funding. Then, of course, in the 80s and 90s, we got into DNA manipulation and molecular biology and genomics and transformation. And so most of the money from public researches or from applied breeding programs went to shorter term research projects. The programs that are left in public sector today do not focus on customer requirements very much, the customer being the farmers and the consumers downstream from those farmers. Most of the programs focus on grant objectives because they're required to get outside grants to continue supporting their applied research. They don't focus on variety development and release. In fact, many of the publicly supported plant breeding programs today don't release any varieties. They release germplasm or pre-varieties or materials to industry to develop into varieties. They're constrained by low budgets. And I mean, plant breeding is a long-term process, but even over the long term, you can either move relatively quickly from generation to generation or very slowly from generation to generation. Well, today, most public plant breeding programs are long-term and moving very, very slowly through that long term because they don't have adequate support. They're based on public genetics, which are basically generic, and they freely publish the results and share germplasm, albeit today most universities are putting at least PVP certificates on their germplasm, and they have material transfer agreements to try to restrict the use of that germplasm, or at least the use of it for any single private entity. All right, private plant breeding programs, on the other hand, focused almost entirely on customer needs. I mean, not just farmers, but milk producers or beef producers or hog producers or chicken producers or the food processors of the world or the large supermarkets or brand name food wholesale distributors. But almost all of the research is focused on customer needs and desires. They develop and release varieties. I mean, private programs by nature are measured by the number and the quality of varieties they release. So they utilize extensive testing of large numbers of hybrids or varieties. They're fast-paced, using 2 to 3 generations per year. They're based on elite proprietary germplasm. So each company has their own base of elite germplasm that they deal with. And sort of in addition to that, each company has sort of their basic germplasm that's sort of like the land races and the germplasm gene banks. I mean, Pioneer has collections of most of the variability of maize germplasm worldwide. Pioneer doesn't care what Summit does with their world germplasm collection, really. They care publicly because you can't just publicly tell Summit, look, you guys just go take a hike, we don't need you, because you're not a good corporate citizen or not a good worldwide citizen. They utilize molecular markers and transgenic technologies. They utilize GIS and GPS technology to increase the efficiencies of running trials. The programs are highly confidential and they legally protect their genetics and their confidential knowledge. And of course, the programs are designed to make a profit. So you don't spend a lot of money on research and development that's not at least designed to make profits. And so when you decide, are you going to work on a certain crop or a certain trade or in a certain geography, the first thing your managers ask for is what we call a pro forma P&L, a pro forma profit and loss statement. How much will it cost us to develop this product, produce it, distribute it, and how much income will we make, and is the market size and the volumes and the margins enough to really justify that we go into that crop or that geography or that trade. I mentioned that we use the GIS and GPS technology. It's really an entire methodology that farmers are adopting in order to measure their productivity and output. So private companies find the traditional ways of running yield trials using replication, randomization, and blocking to try to account or neutralize for environmental variation. Well, those still work, but most farmers don't rely on replicated, randomized plots to decide which varieties to grow. Farmers, on the other hand, run side-by-side comparisons of new potential varieties compared to what they're growing. GPS and information technologies provide a new way to assess the yield, and precision agriculture using GPS and yield monitors allow farmers to monitor the yields of their crops as they run the combine across the field. GPS is based on a system of satellites that allows you to put instrumentation on your tractor or combine or planter or sprayer or whatever, and you can triangulate from satellites to determine just exactly where you're located on the surface of the earth. And the sensitivity of these systems now are down to a few centimeters. I mean, it used to be that the government threw in a sort of a fudge factor so that you could only get within 10 meters. And interesting, the reason they did that is they realized that if you could get to within a few centimeters, then all you had to do was use a GIS or GPS technology, and you could precisely determine exactly where the President of the United States is sitting. And so if you scrambled it, you could know that he's within this area, but you couldn't really directly pick him out. But in the last 10 years or so, the Defense Department has removed all of those restrictions, and you no longer have to do special triangulation stations. Precision agriculture then is basically the concept that we have genetic by environmental variation, and we can either do lots of plots and replications, randomizations, and statistically estimate the environmental variation, or we can measure the actual yield and the actual levels of fertility in the soil for each meter of ground that we're planting, and we can determine very precisely what environmental variations occur and what we have to add or subtract or delete to change those variations. And so we can do variable rate application of fertilizers, pesticides, seed, and we can use the yield monitors to precisely tell you how the yield varies as you move meter by meter across your field. All right, so with a typical private seed company, when we talk about running a program, this is an example from Pioneer of testing maize hybrids. You start out with about 135,000 hybrids evaluated at individual stations each year. You cut that down to about 70,000 hybrids in their first round of across-company testing, run at a large number, at a relatively small number of breeding stations. So the yellow triangle is what happens with the number of hybrids, and the green triangle is what happens with the number of locations. And so as you cut the number of hybrids down, you increase the number of locations until finally you get to on-farm trials with wide area testing of between 800 and 1,100 locations per year. Very, very difficult to do with our old technology, with yield monitors on computers and even yield monitors on research computers. You can do this and integrate all this research very, very easily. And you notice Pioneer not only tests yield, they test quality. This is in maize, and the quality is primarily silage quality for feeding dairy cows, or grain quality for feeding beef, cattle, pork, or chicken. All right, so that's sort of how the programs differ today. How did we get to that difference? Well, hybrids certainly fostered the development of private sector research. I mean, that's true. But private sector research didn't foster the development of hybrids. The first hybrids were developed, produced, distributed first by land-grant universities and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Developed the hybrids. Farmers would pick up the hybrids and pick up the inbred parents and farmers would produce those hybrids for their own use, and then they would sell them to neighbors. And so actually farmers established companies to produce and distribute hybrid seed. Ultimately, actually for Pioneer and Cargill and DeKalb and Funks, about the 1930s through mid-1930s, they started supporting their own breeders, developing their own proprietary materials, and so some private seed companies started proprietary breeding programs. They started that to develop more competitive hybrids so that they could have an advantage to sell that seed to farmers versus the people selling all that generic stuff out of the public sector. But most seed companies did not start their own research and development programs. Most seed companies today in the U.S., in terms of numbers of companies, still sell relatively publicly available genetics. Public sources of elite genetics decreased, not because the private sector companies started breeding themselves. Public sources of elite genetics decreased as public maize breeders retired and were replaced by people who either didn't have the resources to continue the maize breeding program, or didn't have the training, or didn't have the desires to continue the trading. So the public sector started saying, boy, it's good. We've got this maize breeder that's been here for 30 years and he's retiring. Boy, we can get somebody in on some new technology to replace it. Private foundation seed companies were established about this time to start replacing the void left by all of this public genetics being developed by state universities and USDA. And the public seed companies, basically, the foundation seed companies, basically develop new maize inbreds, which they sell to other seed companies which produce and sell hybrids. And even today, it's getting worse, it's getting less and less, but even today, about 35% of the U.S. maize market are held by what are called the small mom and pop companies who do no research and development of inbreds. They buy their inbreds from foundation seed companies, and all they do are hybrid production and distribution. Coincidentally, Monsanto, if you take out the market share of Holden's foundation seed, which sells genetics to other companies, if you take out that market share, Monsanto's still around 35%, and Pioneer now is around 35%. So the two major companies get about 35% of the market each, but the smaller mom and pops get about 35%, or 30, somewhere around a third, a third, a third. What about the other major companies? There aren't many left. So it wasn't the small companies that were eaten up and consumed. It was those middle-level companies. And why did they disappear? Because if a company was spending, as Cargill did, $50 million a year on seed research and development, well, actually we spent only like $20 million a year in the United States, and we didn't have enough market share to generate enough volume because the margins were so low to make a profit on that, they were in trouble. A small company that had no research investment would only buy foundation seed inbreds and sell them, didn't have to worry about that. And so as Pioneer and Monsanto started, Monsanto accumulated companies to get big, as they started developing their companies, it became apparent. It's sort of like a trough you were into. If you were up here and you had a lot of sales and a lot of margins, you could afford your own private research and development. And if you're over here and you had no research and development, all you had to do were buy public inbreds and sell them, you could survive. The companies that were down here that had the high research cost and not enough market share to make enough money, those were the ones that were squeezed out. But hybrids had a big impact. I mean, and they still have a big impact. Today, hybrids account for 40% of the global private seed business. No, 40%, not 100%, 40% of the global private seed business. The hybrids that are sold are maize, sunflower, sorghum, oilseed rape, rice, wheat, cotton, tomato, pepper, melon, cabbages, onion, and other crops. Why are hybrids sold? Not because a seed company decides we can make a hybrid and we can make profits on a hybrid and we can protect the natural property. Hybrids are sold because farmers recognize the return on investment of hybrids. So hybrids was a factor that sort of allowed the private sector to develop, but it really wasn't the private sector that drove the development of hybrids. It was farmers drove the application of hybrids and allowed an opportunity for private companies to step in and fill a need. And the hybrids provided intellectual property protection by themselves. By trade secret protection, you could protect your inbred lines. Nobody knew what your inbred lines were exactly. And you could protect the pedigree of each hybrid that you sold. And since the farmer realized planting F2 seed from the hybrid wasn't economically acceptable, the farmer would gladly come back to you every year to buy your proprietary hybrid. But additional forms of intellectual property protection were needed to spur development of other crops. So in 1970, U.S. Congress passed the Plant Variety Protection Act, provided protection for the basic self-pollinated crops, and greatly expanded private research breeding in wheat, soybeans, and sorghum. The private wheat breeding really never took off competitively. The soybean and sorghum breeding did. In '86, utility patents were first issued on plant varieties that provided even greater protection because it not only allowed the protection of your product so no one could use it and sell it commercially, it provided protection against competitors using your product in other legitimate breeding populations. The first patented biotraits were released in the mid-90s, and the seed industry changed dramatically starting then. What was the impact of the PVP, the Plant Variety Protection Act, and utility patent protection? You got greater commitment to proprietary research and development, which led to an excellent increase in product productivity. The varieties were a lot better, a lot more productive. It didn't change the number of seed companies very much, but it allowed seed companies to expand into non-hybrid crops. And the seed companies without proprietary research still today can license genetics from foundation seed companies. And not only do they license genetics, they license BT gene and Roundup Ready gene, everything. Monsanto will sell all of their technology through their Holden's program as foundation seed, which is kind of a, you know, it looks like a foolish business model, but it's not really. It sort of maximizes their profits. So what happened? Public expenditures, as you see, as this really rise in productivity was occurring, public expenditures sort of went up through the 70s and the 1980, and then sort of stayed flat, and now they're sort of declining. Private expenditures on research starting in the mid-60s started increasing and are still going up, although not quite at this rate. They're beginning to level out for plant breeding research because we'll talk about the consolidation of the industry are cutting back the number of companies. Look at Pioneer's model, for example. You remember that one graph I showed you from 1866 to 1930? Open pollinated varieties, the yield went nowhere. Starting in 1930, the first hybrids were developed, and Henry Wallace founded the foundation, the Pioneer Hybrid Seed Company. Well, that's an old act. It's only asexually propagated plants. So all of this increase was the result of breeding hybrids with trade secret protection. 1970, the Plant Variety Protection Act came into effect, and so Pioneer and other companies broadened out into wheat, sorghum, soybean research, and their research on hybrid maize increased dramatically. UPOV membership just expanded the concepts of the Plant Variety Protection Act and actually eliminated the provisions for farmer-safe seed. than utility patents, but Pioneer's research budget has gone up dramatically over the years. UPOV is the European Union's, it's the Universal Protection of Varieties based in the European Union, and it's very, very similar in legal wording to our Plant Variety Protection Act, except originally our Plant Variety Protection Act allowed farmers to save seed for replanting on their farm. Even a protected variety they could save to plant on their farm, and then they could sell a reasonable amount to neighbors. And of course, the definition of reasonable amount varied considerably between what the seed company thought was reasonable and what some farmers thought was reasonable. UPOV does not allow that they allow farmers to save seed to replant on their own land, but not to sell. And so when U.S. approved UPOV and joined in '81, it changed the provision that allowed farmers to sell seed of protected varieties. And there are a number of very, very classic court cases about seed companies suing farmers for misappropriating their genetics and selling a lot more seed than was allowed under the Plant Variety Protection Act. All right, but that's sort of then historically how we got there. And there were a lot of driving factors, but even the factors that are driving these trends are more extensive than what we've talked about so far. And there are three major trends that are occurring and have occurred over the last 50 years in agriculture that all sort of interact and interface. First, the trend of the shift from public breeding to private multinational sector breeding. I mean, so far I've talked about the shift from public to private U.S. breeding. But as our world became more globalized and a lot of our agricultural priorities and legislation and market stabilization and market interactions changed, we started changing from a local perspective to a global. And that sort of drug public to private seed research conversion into private multinational research. And of course, probably one of the major changes responsible for decreasing support for applied plant breeding research in the public sector is this shift from conventional to molecular approaches. I mean, you'll be faced with this dilemma if you really want to be an applied breeder and develop varieties. Okay, throw a little molecular marker selection in so that you will at least get some key words to get on the map for potential funding from one of our donor agencies. And you might have a chance, but you won't have much of a chance compared to someone that's going to do a molecular marking genomics analysis of a major crop that they can map a certain fraction of the genome in a 4 or 5 year period and demonstrate that in a 5-year grant I can essentially do a pretty complete job. So this shift from conventional to molecular is really driving a lot of the changes in public research, in my view, today. And in fact, one of the major hopes I have of this course is that all of you, whether you're working in molecular approaches to breeding or not, that all of you will get an appreciation, as the major biotech companies did, that the molecular technology and research is very good, it's essential, it's very rewarding, it's produced a lot of excellent new technology. But if you're dealing with agricultural systems, none of that technology has much value at all to a farmer unless you can put it in a competitive variety that that farmer can grow and grow for a profit. And so if we lose all of these public streams of germplasm, competitive germplasm, because we're putting most of our money in molecular research rather than development and release of varieties, ultimately we're at the mercy of industry to maintain that flow of germplasm. And it's unfortunate because this is a flow of germplasm that started 10,000 years ago, or 10 million years ago in evolution of crops. So what is this privatization driven by? Of course, increased intellectual property protection allows companies to protect their investment, and that drove a lot of the research. But it's driven by consolidation of the global agricultural industry, not just the seed industry. In fact, a lot of the seed industry consolidation was driven by consolidation of the large pharmaceutical or ag chemical companies which own various seed companies, as Novartis and Ciba-Geigy, or as Funks and Sandoz merged to form Novartis, their seed companies merged, or one was cast out. So as all of these mergers between these multinational agricultural industries came together, that drove privatization. Advances in molecular biology. If you have the money and the resources to utilize the very best of the molecular technology coming out of the public sector and to buy it in terms of paying whatever royalties or patent rights or licensing privileges, then that tends to drive the research into a private sector that can afford to utilize it, but also restrictions on the use of public germplasm, which is really too bad, because with all of our conventions on biological diversity, a lot of developing countries said, we have all of these valuable genes and all of this germplasm, and these multinational corporations are coming in and stripping out our best genes and producing varieties and making big profits, and we should be paid for those genes. Well, they were about 100 years too late, or maybe 10,000 years too late, or maybe a few million years too late, because those private corporations have all of that germplasm that they need. And so today, with the International Treaty on Plant Germplasm for Food and Agriculture, the private companies say, sure, we'll agree to your standard material transfer agreement for what we have to do if we utilize anything from these world collections. And we're not worried about it, because if we do, we'll pay 1% royalty on the products that we derive, and those royalties will go back to the germplasm trust, not to the individual country. But we don't care about that, because we're not going to use very much of it anyway. But publicly supported plant breeders in the developing world in the last few years have had their hands tied behind their back, because they can't get access to that germplasm until the Global Trust developed that standard material transfer agreement, and all of the governments and all of the countries agreed on it. So ironically, the intentions were good to keep industry from stripping out that public germplasm, but the result was just the opposite. The restrictions drove a lot more of the breeding into the private sector, because public sector breeders lacked the germplasm. They couldn't get access to it. So how is this all what is the state? How has it all come together now? Well, the top 10 seed companies control about 1/2 of the $22 billion commercial seed markets worldwide. So the top 10 companies have half of the $22 billion market. But that research from those companies is concentrated on a few crops and a few traits that are of commercial importance. Those are the companies. I just put that in for your information. You notice Monsanto finally got to be listed #1. Pioneer has always been #1 seed company in the world. And probably Monsanto's stay in #1 is short term. When the next poll comes out next year, they'll probably lose some of that 2.8 million profit. That's a pro forma. That's what they think they'll make next year if you combine the Seminis business they bought in '05 with Monsanto's business. and they won't maintain all of that. So, but Pioneer and Monsanto and Pioneer and owned by DuPont are basically number one. Then you drop down to Syngenta, then another drop to Groupe Limagran, then another drop to sort of the lessers of, and you notice even now there's like top 10 plus 1 this year because there's not much difference between DLF and Delta Pineland. All right? So with all that happening, what is the role of public sector plant breeding today, or what should it be? And you know, I go to meetings on this frequently, and there are all sorts of committees and lots of discussion. Everyone can agree education and training of plant breeders is the role of the public sector. The private sector doesn't do a lot of basic training. They do a lot of advanced training once they hire breeders, but they need the basic training. But that training involves courses, and up to half of your training as a plant breeder will come in the form of courses and seminars and lectures and symposia. But at least half has got to come with you working with an applied breeder or with a breeder in a breeding program in a field and learning day to day how to do selections and recombinations and how to do various things. It's getting harder and harder for public programs to provide that hands-on training if most of our public breeding programs don't develop and release varieties. I mean, that's a dilemma, and I worry a little bit about that, but I'm already have accepted the concept that training of applied plant breeders, or in my mind, the whole plant breeder that does the applied as well as the molecular, it's moving offshore from the U.S. It's already moved out of Europe. Europe doesn't do any of it anymore. In the U.S., it's moving offshore rapidly. Hence, I'm involved in training projects in Thailand and South Africa and soon to be in Ghana, because there we have applied plant breeding programs into which we can incorporate the molecular tools and the training. Public programs should work on breeding methodology development, and they certainly do. New methods of conventional methods for breeding, but also integrating molecular-based systems into breeding. And that's one of the most vital functions of public plant breeding programs today, particularly the integration of molecular marker systems and genomic analysis systems into breeding systems. Germplasm preservation and development, the characterization and collection, but also incorporation of useful traits from wild relatives or land races that were left out in the bottlenecks of evolution, that you can incorporate them back into agronomically adapted material. That's very, very important for both public sector and the private. And then we keep saying that the public sector has to breed the minor crops. Small market crops that industry ignores. Well, the reason industry ignores most of these small market crops is there is no economic justification to have a well-developed research and development program for those crops. And so you have to pick your minor crops very carefully. I know a lot of public breeders. I had one public breeder tell me that I can't get any support from industry because industry is not interested at all in any solanaceous crops other than tomatoes and potatoes and some of the fruit trees. And I start thinking, well, what crops are you working on? And he named a couple of species I'd never heard of. And I mean, this guy is from a prominent U.S. university. I said, are a lot of people in your state growing that stuff? No, nobody's growing it. Are a lot of people in the world growing that? No, nobody's growing it. But I think it's a minor, it could be a minor crop, and I'd like to get money to develop it. I'm thinking, yeah, you know, I'd like to do a lot of things that would be intellectually stimulating to me, and unfortunately, people don't want to pay me to do that because no one else is interested in my interest. All right, so we said that basic plant breeding, you know, that should be, basic means like all the pre-breeding stuff, that should be in the public sector. Well, here's 2001 data, SAES, or State Agricultural Experiment Systems, and USDA Economic Research Service, or the other public sector. You can see 85 and 54, almost the same amount of emphasis in public as in the private sector. Germplasm enhancement, 71 and 33, 96, yeah. That's basically taking traits from near relatives or land races and putting them in germplasm and releasing sources of germplasm. A lot of public programs today, that's as far as they go. Germplasm enhancement and release. Well, industry does some of that, but accepts from public as well.
What are the units on those numbers?
What are the units? I think this is in scientific years, scientific person years. So how many breeders are working on those crops in public versus private sectors? Cultivar development, 144 in the state university systems, 22 in USDA versus 673 in the private sector. Very clear that today, cultivar development, the private sector in the U.S. is ahead of anything we're doing in the public sector. What about crops? The blue are the state experiment stations, the sort of maroon color are USDA, and the greenish yellow, the lemon green color is private. Fruit crops, still a lot of public breeding going on. Wheat, still a considerable amount of public breeding going on. Ornamentals, almost half and half. Vegetables, more private sector than public. Forages, more private than public. Soybean, we get worse. Cotton, we get worse. Maize is 90% or more in the private sector. And this is not just forage sorghum. This is sorghum. I mean, nothing in the public sector. So is today's public sector, is a public sector meeting our needs today? Well, public sector research on crops like sorghum, millet, and cassava is negligible in terms of variety development. We do a lot of very, very nice research on markers and genomics. But developing varieties of sorghum, well, these are crops that are needed desperately by farmers in developing countries. And in the U.S., we just, other than the molecular aspects, we ignore those crops. Public research on traits for marginal areas, stressed areas, salty areas, dry areas, hot areas, or for nutritional enhancement is very small. And in general, in the U.S., the limited budgets we have for these crops doesn't really meet the needs of the poor worldwide. I mean, in a way you say, well, I mean, after all, this is U.S. for U.S., so why should we worry about the needs worldwide? But you'll find a lot of the people in U.S. public sector today are saying, oh, yeah, but we're doing this for world food security. Well, if you want to work on public sector applied breeding for world food security in the U.S., you should be working on sorghum, millet, and cassava, and not a lot of other crops. I mean, I'm sorry, that's where the needs are. Those top 10 countries spend $3 billion per year on agricultural research. The CIGAR centers, all of the international research centers, spend $300 million a year, but the percent of that $300 million that goes to plant breeding activities rather than environmental farming system other activities has dropped from 75% in the 70s to 35% in the 90s. So 35% of that $300 million goes to applied breeding. And certain countries, Brazil, China, and India, spend about $500 million per year in agricultural research, plant breeding. So just to summarize sort of a history for the U.S. system, the world system is still evolving historically. We started with farmer-selected seed and saved it. Very, very slow rate of varietal development and very little improvement in productivity. Improved varieties developed by public breeding programs. The establishment of the state land-grant colleges had a significant impact. It replaced the farmers' varieties, but it increased the rate of varietal development and productivity, but it produced generic varieties. Private seed research started with hybrids, but it greatly increased the rate of varietal development and productivity. It produced elite proprietary varieties, and it really catalyzed the organization of the seed distribution, production and distribution system. So the bottom line is, if you're interested in private sector research, then from this course onward, you might consider a little bit different curriculum and a little bit different sort of training than if you're interested in the public sector research and